The United States House of Representatives in late November passed a dangerous piece of legislation that many are calling the nonprofit killer bill. In spring of this year, when the bill was discussed as a means to silence pro-Palestinian activism, and when Democratic Party nominee Kamala Harris might have been favored to win, dozens of House Democrats supported it. But after Donald Trump's White House win, some among them initially blocked H.R. 9495 on a technicality amid fears that the incoming president would use it as a tool to bludgeon his perceived enemies. It was then reintroduced, voted on with significantly less Democratic support, and passed. But really, should it have been introduced or passed to begin with, no matter what the political winds of the time? Journalists and their advocates are instead urging the passage of the Press Act. Joining me to tell us all about it is Jenna Ruddock, Policy Counsel at the media democracy organization Free Press, where her work focuses on digital civil rights, surveillance, protest, and tech. She's also a researcher, documentary photographer, and a producer with a background in community media and factual streaming. Welcome to the program, Jenna.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get to what the Press Act is and why it's a really important piece of legislation, let's talk about the importance of the so-called nonprofit killer bill, as many are calling it, and why it's so dangerous that so many organizations and individuals are urging that it not pass the Senate. It's already passed the House, and essentially it's supposed to have something to do, the title has something to do with taxes, and also it's a terror financing and tax penalties on American Hostages Act. But it's really, as far as I can tell, the danger of it has nothing to do with American hostages. What would H.R. 9495 do if the Senate were to pass its own version?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the bill was initially introduced in April, and at that point, it only included the so-called terror financing provisions, which I'll get into. In September, when it was reintroduced, it was packaged in with provisions about reducing tax penalties for Americans held hostage or detained abroad. And so those two pieces were pushed together in September. But the really concerning provision that we have raised alarms about is in H.R. 9495 is the so-called terror financing provisions. And what it would really do is it would enable the political targeting of nonprofits, including nonprofit newsrooms. And it would do that by giving the Secretary of the Treasury, who is an administration official appointed by the president, almost unilateral discretion to designate a nonprofit as a terrorist supporting organization. And within 90 days of that designation, strip the nonprofit of its tax-exempt status if the organization isn't able to rebut the accusations to the Treasury Secretary's satisfaction. And the real concern here is that the bill circumvents existing due process because the activities it's supposedly concerned with, which is material support for terrorism, is already illegal under federal law. But what this bill would do is that it would effectively shift the burden of proof from the government to civil society.
Civil society is represented in part or often has its sort of voice and advocacy done through the nonprofit world. Meanwhile, you have for-profit corporations that now are going to have far more representation in the halls of power in government. Trump's cabinet, if the Senate passes, his appointees will be filled with billionaires. They also, of course, have the money to spend on super PACs, thanks to Citizens United. Their political speech is, available aplenty. They can do what they want with it. And nonprofits are already bound, not just by not speaking out in favor of terrorism, but also simply by speaking in favor of political candidates or not, right? I mean, there's so much self-censorship that already goes on because nonprofit organizations and media are scared of running afoul of 501c3 rules. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think absolutely. The tax code, like you mentioned, this bill is focused on the tax code, and that already creates constraints for organizations who want to protect their tax-exempt status.
And so you have a situation where you have an incoming president who has already promised basically to punish his political enemies, those in the media and outside it who critiqued him. months ago, Democrats thought it would be, when they were against pro-Palestinian activism, thought it was perfectly fine to, and many of them, like I believe way more than the 50 of them supported it initially. But really, it all does depend on who's in power and who is able to wield unaccountable power, right? Democrats should have opposed it no matter what. All members of the House should have opposed it no matter what, because the next time it could be maybe a Democratic president coming in and waving that law in front of or against conservative media, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's nothing about the bill itself that is partisan. The authority that it would create would enable any administration to abuse it again and use it to target nonprofits. So I think that's something that has not been as foregrounded in the conversation, but really should be really right at the core.